Believe it or not, there were only 3 vampire legends in New Orleans before Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles put Lestat and Louis in the mix. The Casket Girls, Jacques St. and the Carter brothers. And perhaps some, or all, of these legends are a result of Anne's imagination putting vampires in New Orleans to begin with. I'm Leah Pearl, and this is New Orleans Vampires, Legends and Lore, a 5-block deep tour. The Carter Brothers. Start at 800 Royal on the corner of St. Anne. We begin in 1932, during the Great Depression. Brothers John and Wayne Carter lived in the building on the corner. Normal guys with normal jobs. One morning, a woman escaped the building, running down Royal Street terrified. Her wrists were slashed just enough to let blood, but not enough to kill her quickly. She told the police that the brothers had cut her wrists and drank her blood, but they were careless securing her ropes when they left for work. However, they would find other victims securely tied in the building. Sure enough, several other people were bound with similarly slashed wrists. The police were waiting for the brothers when they returned, and they confessed that they were vampires and wanted to be stopped. They were tried as serial killers and executed by the state of Louisiana. The brothers were buried in their family tomb. When they opened the vault to bury the next family member, no remains of the brothers were found. So is it true? This legend does not appear in the French Quarter from 1936, nor in the New Orleans City Guide from 1938, both so close to the claimed date of the legend. A wonderful blog from 2021 is entitled HowDeathPenaltyUSA.org helped debunk a New Orleans vampire tale. That is a promising headline. In the article, Courtney Brock debunks this legend every which way, including that there were no Carter brothers who were executed by the state ever, much less in 1932, and that serial killers did not yet exist as a concept in 1932. During a lecture entitled The Evolution of Horror Tours in New Orleans at the New Orleans City Archives and Special Collections, Randy Bibb shared that he worked for one of the original tour companies, and that the legend was made up by the owner of Magic Walking Tours, Richard Rochester, around 1993. Rochester admitted he made it up. I found this press still on eBay with the photographer's original caption and the description of the story. Randy also shared a similar write-up that was published in the early 90s during his talk. The description reads, quote, "If the stories he tells seem a bit incredible, it's because he sort of makes some of them up." Unquote. Jacques St. Continue 2 blocks on Royal downtown to the corner of Ursuline's, where you'll find a former corner store at 1039. Jacques St. was an aristocratic newcomer who was about 40 years old at the turn of the century and never seemed to age. He claimed to be a descendant of Comte St. Germain, and soon there was a rumor that he was the Comte. He liked to throw elaborate parties with huge spreads, impressive food in an impressive food town. However, like he mysteriously never aged, no one ever saw him eating anything either. After a party one night around 1903, a woman escaped his home by jumping off the balcony. She was terrified and claimed that St. Germain bit her neck. She was able to escape because he was distracted by a knock. The police asked to question St. Germain, but it was so late and he was so tired. He requested that they do it in the morning, and the police agreed. St. Germain disappeared. In his home, they found nothing left but corked bottles of wine mixed with human blood. There are no references to these events in the newspaper or police reports, and we have no evidence of anyone named St. Germain at the 1039 Royal address. Alexander Basek operated a crockery store out of this location until at least 1908. I had a harder time pinning down St. Germain's origin. It's possibly from the early 2000s, according to a post on Reddit. None of the modern tour books even mention this myth that I could find. This doesn't seem to be a part of Richard Rochester's repertoire. I asked a friend who worked for Haunted History Tours, one of the companies operating since the 1990s, And he said that they were true believers over there who didn't admit to making up stories or encourage anyone to make up stories. Haunted History and Magic Walking Tours were just two of the tour companies operating then. Several other walking tour companies in the mid-90s or early 2000s could have contributed to the lore with the St. Germain story. The Casket Girls. Travel 1 block toward the river to Charters and you'll find the old Ursuline convent at 1100 Charters Street. The legend of the Filles à la Casket starts before the colony of Louisiana or the city of New Orleans existed. In the early days of exploration, explorers were only men who traipsed the globe looking for land to conquer, resources to steal, and people to kill. When they settled in Louisiana and finally New Orleans, the men started having babies with the women they enslaved, or running off to the woods to be with the Indian women. They realized a flourishing colony would require women and families. By that, they meant white women and white families. So in 1728, the French sent over some reputable women to be the wives of the settlers. They came with small wooden chests, casket in French, presumably with their belongings. The women arrived with sickly complexions and bloody mouths. They were housed on the 3rd floor of the old Ursuline convent, with their chests, and the shutters were nailed shut. The nuns were hiding the girls from the settlers because they were displaying signs of supernatural diagnosis. Eventually, the casket is anglicized to casket. Perhaps the women were the original American vampires. Perhaps they are still there. So what can we prove? The word in French for the small wooden chests is cassette, not casket. The women were probably pale with bloody mouths because they had scurvy from a lack of fresh fruit or tuberculosis on the voyage to New Orleans, if that is even true. The French started sending women to New Orleans and Louisiana as early as 1721, before the Ursuline nuns arrived in 1727. The old Ursuline convent that is standing was built in the 1750s. The one previous to it was built in the 1730s, so they wouldn't have been housed on this 3rd floor. In addition, the Casket Girls legend originates after the 1987 visit by Pope John Paul II. I say this confidently because the shutters did not yet exist on the building. The legend falls apart with just these facts. In the 1904 Picayune Guide to New Orleans, there is no association of vampires with the Casket Girls. Instead, the guide provides information about the Petticoat Rebellion. There is no mention of vampires with the Casket Girls in the 1938 New Orleans City Guide. By the 2018 edition of the Lonely Planet New Orleans Guide, the association of vampires with the Casket Girls was cemented in local lore. Because this is another Richard Rochester special, he also admitted to making this story up, back to the same news still on eBay. Quote, Richard Rochester pauses on Charter Street opposite the old Ursuline convent to point out what he claims is a haunted section of the 3rd floor. Unquote. Even though he visited since the 1970s, Richard didn't move to New Orleans until 1990, so the shutters were always there in his New Orleans. Anne Rice. Walk 1 block back to Royal Street, and then less than a block downtown to 1132. Anne Rice wrote her first novel, Interview with a Vampire, in 1973 and published it in 1976. So her vampires actually predate all of the other stories of vampires in New Orleans. It wasn't until the movies were made, filming starting in 1993, that the vampire lore took hold of the Crescent City. She later said that this building, the Gallier House, was Lestat's house. L. Piatti Farnell, in a 2017 article titled "The Blood Never Stops Flowing and the Party Never Ends," wrote, quote, mixed with historical rumors and Gothic folklore, the recent narratives of popular culture lie at the center of the reimagination of New Orleans as a vampire spot. Most scholars claim that it all started with the publication of Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire in 1976, but actually evidence shows that the vampire narrative for the city of New Orleans did not fully explode until the release of Neil Jordan's cinematic adaptation of Interview with a Vampire in 1994. This film really put New Orleans at the center of the vampire narrative, including in the use of many iconic locations in the city as tied to vampire, and cementing the idea of New Orleans as a vampiric city." Unquote. It's true that before Anne Rice, many found it ridiculous to associate antebellum New Orleans with vampires. The first sentence of the review of her first novel in 1976 reads, quote, "The seemingly unlikely combination of vampirism and antebellum Louisiana has been blended by native New Orleanian Anne Rice into ingredients for a highly successful first novel, Interview with a Vampire." Unquote. Vampire history. Walk to your favorite bar or the wine you haven't tried yet. Perhaps the Vampire Cafe is a good place to end your journey while I offer a conclusion. In the Encyclopedia of Word and Phrase Origins, we learn, quote, "Vampire is one of the few English words of Hungarian origin. It comes from the Magyar vampir and is infrequently spelled that way, although its ultimate source may be the Turkish Uber, or witch, the word for a creature of the living dead, or a reanimated corpse that spends its nights searching for human blood to quaff, is first recorded in English in 1734, and is the same in Russian, Polish, Czechoslovakian, Serbian, and Bulgarian. The term vampire was popularized by Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897, and some 47 spin-offs of the novel." Unquote. 1734 is after the colonization of Louisiana by Europeans. 1734 is after the Casket Girls. Charles Gaillard's History of Louisiana from 1854 does not mention vampires. John Smith Kendall's History of New Orleans Volume 1 from 1922 does not mention vampires. The French Quarter by Herbert Asbury from 1936 does not mention vampires. The only mention of vampires in the 1938 New Orleans City Guide is an exhibit of vampire bats in the New Orleans Natural History Museum, which was located in Gibson Hall then. In the newspaper, vampire is largely used as an insult to mean a monster or someone who is greedy in the 19th and early 20th century. Then it's used to describe women in movies, which is soon shortened to vamp. Nothing Innocent Old New Orleans Custom by Laura Robinson from 1948. Harnett Kane's Queen New Orleans from 1949 does not mention vampires either. The Lonely Planet started writing guides to New Orleans in 1997, so plenty of vampire tours already existed in the post-Anne Rice world. The 2018 8th edition of the New Orleans Lonely Planet includes the vampire version of the Casket Girls story. The only other mention of vampires is the 4 mentions of Passions, the vampire-themed speakeasy. I think they meant potions, as Passions was a strip club in the East. And a couple of mentions of Anne Rice in this edition. According to a 1999 article in the Baton Rouge Advocate, the Gathering of the Coven event hosted by Anne Rice's Vampire Lestat fan club started in 1988. That same article says that the vampire tours are so available that they don't list a particular company. The Endless Night Vampire Ball started in 1996 and had a website since at least 1998. The first mention I found in the newspaper about vampire tours is from 1994. By 1996, the news is about the hostility between companies regarding out-of-towners hosting tours featuring admittedly made-up stories, namely an Alabamian named Richard Rochester who ran magic walking tours. In the article, he claimed that the tours were running since 1993, and they definitely were, but no business entity was registered to him until January 29, 1996, 4 days after Sidney Smith registered Haunted History Tours on January 25, 1996. Seems that they really didn't care about the made-up stories, though, and cared more that Richard had a habit of taunting groups and heckling guides. A native New Orleanian, Smith's Haunted History iteration was a direct response to Rochester's magic walking tours. Rochester openly admitted that he made up the stories and called the tours street theater rather than history tours. The two were successful and developed a rivalry that included tours of 100 at its peak. The rivalry eventually erupted. Residents were not amused by the tour guides' antics and loudly sharing false stories nightly. The city stepped in and started regulating tour guides in 2003. One of the original haunted tours in New Orleans, you can still take haunted history tours in 2025. We lost the legend who helped create the tour world that we know, Sidney Smith, earlier this year to pancreatic cancer. Last I found, the legend who started it all, Richard Rochester, was in an article from 2012 in Offbeat magazine saying he moved to Indonesia seeking more adventures. No one thought vampires lived in New Orleans until Anne Rice imagined them here, though. And when Anne Rice decided New Orleans had vampires, many were skeptical. Even still, we have Richard Rochester and Sidney Smith to thank for these vampire legends in New Orleans, and their rivalry to thank for the regulations on tour guides in the French Quarter. By the way, there's still plenty of tour guides operating illegally and telling false stories in 2025. I know because I get huge spikes on my website right around the time tours end on topics like La Laurie, Romeo spikes, and of course, ghosts. Perhaps those tour guides are the real vampires sucking the life out of the city and leaving a trail of tasteless, morbid crumbs that even those opting into the tours can't believe. Regardless, I think the stories about vampires are among the most ethical of the morbid fantasies that tour guides like to spin about New Orleans. For one, they are not and cannot be real people. The ghost stories about enslaved people can be wildly disrespectful and dehumanizing to the people they are about, because we really did enslave people in Louisiana. But vampires are not real. In one of the articles about Richard, he describes his tours as a mix of history and entertainment. Richard never claimed to be strictly telling historical events and took every opportunity to make it known that his stories were embellished. In the first pages of Feared At, Michael Murphy interviews Anne Rice, who grew up in New Orleans. He asked her about her personal paranormal experiences. Quote, "No, I've never had a single solitary supernatural experience in my entire life. Never seen a ghost, never felt anything paranormal. But wow, have I heard the stories from my fellow New Orleanians on the ghosts that they've seen and loved." Unquote. Anne and I have this in common, and I would love to hear more of your real paranormal stories. Please share in the comments. Maybe we can be influential enough that your true story becomes the new legend of New Orleans. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the legends and lore of New Orleans vampires. I have included the sources in the description. Please like and subscribe for more tours and stories from the deep. Coming soon.